There is something about shopping centres in 1980s Britain that people who were there have never quite been able to explain to those who were not. The atmosphere was specific. The stores were specific. The feeling of spending an entire Saturday afternoon inside one with friends and a small amount of cash was something that belonged entirely to that decade and that country. For those who remember it, the memories are immediate. The smells come back first, then the sounds, then the names of the stores. This is what going to the shopping centre actually felt like in 1980s Britain. Let's walk back through it together. Arriving meant coming by bus or by car. If your family drove, you pulled into a car park that wrapped around the outside of the building. Multi-storey concrete with low ceilings, the smell of exhaust and damp. Finding a space on a Saturday took patience. You would circle the levels slowly, waiting for reversing lights, watching for brake lights further down the row. If you came by bus, you walked from the stop along a paved approach, the centre rising ahead of you in brown brick or pale concrete. A glass canopy over the main entrance, the names of the anchor stores mounted high on the facade. Debenhams, British Home Stores, Marks and Spencer. The names told you everything before you stepped inside. Walking through the entrance meant pushing through heavy glass doors into a different world. The temperature changed immediately. Outside was whatever Britain had offered that day. Cold, usually. Damp, frequently. Both, often enough. Inside was warm and still and dry. The lighting was even and artificial, with strip lights running the full length of the ceiling, with no shadows and no weather. You were no longer outside. You were somewhere else entirely. The smell arrived before anything else registered. Every centre had the same bass note. Warm synthetic fabric, floor cleaner, and the distant suggestion of food. Underneath that was something that varied depending on where the food concessions sat. If Greggs was near the entrance, you smelled baked pastry within seconds. If the centre had a Wimpy, the smell of grilled meat and warm bread reached further than you expected. The smell of the shopping centre was not unpleasant. It was specific. It was consistent. If you encountered it now, you would place it immediately. The sounds came next. Music played from speakers set into the ceiling, low enough to be present without being intrusive. Footsteps echoed on the tiled floor. Voices carried across the open corridor. From somewhere further in came the electronic noise of an arcade, a constant background layer of beeps and synthesized sounds that you could hear from 100 yards away. The shopping centre had its own soundtrack. It sounded like nowhere else. The layout followed a deliberate logic. A long central corridor ran from one end of the building to the other. Stores lined both sides. The anchor department stores sat at each end, one at each terminus, drawing you through the full length of the centre to reach whichever one you needed. To get from Debenhams to Marks and Spencer, you walked past every smaller store in between. That was the design. That was always the design. Some centres had a second floor reached by escalator, with a low railing along the upper level so you could look down at the ground floor below. Some had a glazed roof section that admitted grey British daylight. Most were entirely sealed. Their own climate, their own light, their own world. The floor was hard tile, pale or patterned, showing every footprint by mid-morning. Benches ran along the walls at intervals, where older shoppers rested and watched people pass. Planters with large, hardy plants stood at corners and junctions. The centre was designed to keep you comfortable enough to stay longer than you had planned. The clothing stores dominated the corridor. They came in sequence, one after another, each with a window display and its own smell of new fabric and carpet. Chelsea Girl was where teenage girls went first. Rails of bright tops and jeans and the particular affordable fashion that defined the decade. Dorothy Perkins was slightly older in its appeal, more considered, more purposeful. Etam sat nearby. C&A was larger and cheaper. A store where you could find almost anything. The racks long and densely packed, the changing rooms at the back perpetually occupied on a Saturday afternoon. For men and older boys, Burton and Topman offered slim trousers and patterned shirts and casual jackets that looked deliberate without looking formal. The windows were updated every season to reflect whatever the charts and the television were suggesting people should wear. You would stop and look even if you had no intention of going inside. The shoe shops came between the clothing stores. Freeman Hardy Willis had walls of shoes on angled shelves and staff who disappeared into a back room and returned with boxes. Dulcis was slightly more aspirational. Saxone sat somewhere between the two. The ritual of buying shoes was specific. You waited to be served. A member of staff measured your foot with a metal gauge, disappeared, and returned with options. You sat in a low chair while they knelt and fitted each pair. The process felt formal in a way that matched the significance of what was being purchased. The record shop was essential. Our price had racks of cassettes and LP sleeves arranged alphabetically, a chart singles section near the front, and a back wall for whatever genre was considered important that week. By the mid-80s, compact discs had appeared on a separate rack, their cases taller and thinner, either prices noticeably higher. You would stand and read the back of album sleeves for long periods without buying anything. The staff tolerated this. Reading the sleeve was part of the experience. HMV, where it existed, was larger and felt more serious. Its selection was broader. Its atmosphere was slightly more reverent. The chart rack near the entrance confirmed what you already half knew from the radio. You would run your finger down the list and find the singles you recognized, then look for them in the racks. Buying a single was not a casual decision when you were working from pocket money. You thought about it carefully. Then there was Woolworths. Every shopping centre had one, and Woolworths occupied a category entirely its own. It was not quite a department store and not quite a specialist shop. It was Woolworths. The pick and mix counter was near the front, a long run of open plastic bins filled with sweets of every kind, each bin with a metal scoop and a roll of paper bags hanging from a hook. You would take a bag, work your way along the counter, selecting individual sweets with the scoop, and take the bag to be weighed at the end. Cola bottles were light and plentiful. Chocolate items cost you faster than you expected. You learned the economics of the counter quickly. The singles rack in Woolworths ran along one wall, the chart positions marked on small cards. The toy aisle was at the back. Wide aisles of boxed games and action figures and pocket money toys that you could afford on a good week. Woolworths was the store you entered with no specific purpose and left having spent more time than you intended. It rewarded aimless presence. It was irreplaceable in a way that only became clear after it was gone. The arcade was positioned away from the main retail corridor, dark inside, even at midday, lit primarily by the screens of the machines themselves and the flashing border lights of the cabinets. The sound was immediate and physical. A wall of electronic noise made up of dozens of different games running simultaneously. Space Invaders, Defender, Pac-Man, Galaga. Later, Street Fighter and Double Dragon. The machines took 10-pence coins, sometimes 20 pence, and the coins went quickly. You would arrive with a small stack and be down to your last two within 20 minutes if you were not disciplined. The best players drew a crowd, someone who could reach the later levels of Defender, or who knew the patterns in Galaga would have 3 or 4 people standing behind them watching. High scores were recorded with initials. Getting your initials onto a high score board was a genuine achievement, something worth mentioning on Monday morning. The arcade smelled of warm electronics and, in the early part of the decade, cigarette smoke, because smoking indoors was ordinary and unremarkable. The food options were consistent. Wimpy was the sit-down restaurant. It was the closest most British shopping centres came to American-style fast food before McDonald's arrived and changed everything. The Wimpy was different from what came after. It had tables and a laminated menu, and a member of staff who took your order. The bender in a bun was a curved sausage in a round roll. The hamburgers came in cardboard boxes. Brown sauce was available in a bottle on the table. And the experience was slower and more formal than what fast food would later become. On a Saturday afternoon with friends, it felt like a proper meal in a proper place. Greggs was not a sit-down experience. It was a bakery counter, and you stopped there on the move. A sausage roll in a paper bag, eaten while walking. A steak bake, if you were being careful with money that week. The smell of Greggs reached you before you saw the frontage. Warm pastry and meat, and a particular yeasty warmth that belonged entirely to that counter. Saturday was a social institution. The shopping centre was not a destination you arrived at with a plan. You arrived on the bus with friends and you wandered. The bus journey was part of it, the anticipation building over 15 or 20 minutes as the town centre grew closer. You arranged to meet at the bus station or outside the main entrance, and then the afternoon was yours. There were no mobile phones. You agreed on a location in advance, and you were either there at the agreed time or you were not. The fountain in the central atrium was the common meeting point, the clock above the Debenhams entrance, the bench outside Woolworths. If your friends were not there when you arrived, you waited. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15. You had no way of knowing whether they were late or had forgotten or were not coming at all. You waited until you had waited long enough, and then you made a decision. The uncertainty was ordinary. It was simply the condition of making plans. For teenagers, just the shopping centre was freedom. Warm, covered, safe freedom that required no justification to parents because it was a shopping centre and therefore a respectable destination. You could go where you wanted inside it, stay as long as you liked in any given store, leave when you chose. The centre was yours for the afternoon. That was the point. The purpose was being there. You would try on clothes you had no intention of buying. This was understood. The changing rooms in Chelsea Girl or Top Man on a Saturday afternoon were full of people performing the act of shopping rather than completing it. You would take 4 things into the cubicle, try all 4, decide nothing was affordable or nothing was right, hang everything back, and leave. Everyone knew. It was part of the rhythm. Cash was the only currency that mattered. There were no credit cards for teenagers. You had whatever was in your pocket, drawn from pocket money or from wages, if you were old enough to have a Saturday job. A Saturday job wage in the mid-80s might be £15 or £20 for a full day. That felt substantial at the start of the afternoon. It diminished faster than expected. When the money was gone, it was gone. There was no extending it. Physical money meant physical limits, and those limits shaped every decision the afternoon required. The Argos ritual was its own experience. The catalogue was the size of a telephone directory, mounted on a chain at a long counter, its pages soft from repeated handling. You found what you wanted, noted the catalogue number on a small slip of paper using one of the tiny pencils provided in a cup, paid at the desk, and received a numbered receipt. Then you waited. A display board showed numbers. When your number appeared, you went to the collection hatch and your item emerged from somewhere behind the wall. The process was systematic and slightly mysterious. You never saw where the items came from. Shopping with parents followed entirely different rules. Parents had lists. They came with specific intentions. Back to school, shopping meant working through stores in a deliberate order, comparing prices, checking sizes, moving efficiently. Your mother would compare the price of the same item in 2 different stores before committing. Your father would wait outside with an expression that communicated a preference for finishing soon. With friends, it was the opposite. With friends, the food court was the destination. You would find a table and sit for longer than the food required. 1 drink could last an hour. You watched people arrive and leave. You saw people from school and either acknowledged them or did not, depending on the social calculation. The food court was where the afternoon's social life became visible. Who was there, who they were with, who sat together and who sat apart. The shopping centre was not just a place to shop, it was somewhere to be seen. What the shopping centre actually was, beneath the retail and the food and the arcades, was covered public space. Britain did not have much of it. The weather made outdoor gathering unreliable for most of the year. Parks were cold and exposed. Town centres were open to whatever the sky was doing. The shopping centre solved a problem that nobody had formally identified, but everyone had felt. It was warm, it was dry, it was free to enter. You could stay as long as you wanted without being required to spend anything. For a country with the British climate, this was not a minor convenience. It was the structural reason the shopping centre became what it became. The social life inside had its own rules that nobody wrote down, but everyone understood. Certain tables in the food court belonged to certain groups, not by any formal arrangement, but by repeated occupation. The same people sat in the same places week after week, and that became the understood arrangement. You knew where to find people. You knew which part of the arcade belonged to the older boys, and which machines the younger ones could use without consequence. The centre had its own hierarchy, its own geography, its own social order. Security guards patrolled the corridors. They were usually older men or younger men who looked mildly bored. They would tell teenagers to stop running or to keep their voices down. They would break up the occasional argument. Security was not aggressive. It was present. The centre was safe because it was watched, and it was watched lightly enough that you did not feel supervised. That balance was part of what made it work. The Christmas transformation made the centre's role as public space most visible. From late November, everything changed. Tinsel and lights appeared along the corridor ceiling, suspended in long loops between the shop fronts. A large Christmas tree arrived in the central atrium, tall enough to reach the upper level. Santa's grotto was constructed nearby, a small enclosed structure with an entrance shaped like a cottage door, a queue of children extending from it that wound back through the atrium and down the corridor. The children stood in their coats holding their parents' hands, patient in the way children become when the reward is sufficiently significant. The music changed. The regular piped rotation gave way to Christmas songs cycling through the speakers from late November until Christmas Eve, Slade and Wizard and Shakin' Stevens. You heard the same songs every visit, and by mid-December they were inseparable from the experience of being there. Near the entrance or near the grotto, a stall sold mulled wine or hot chocolate, and the smell of spiced warm liquid added itself to the usual bass note of the building. The centre in December smelled different from the centre in October. It smelled like the season itself. The crowds were at their peak in December. The car park was full from opening time. The corridors were dense with people moving slowly, carrying bags, stopping without warning to look in windows. The food court had no spare tables. The queues at the Wimpy stretched back from the counter. Finding anyone you had arranged to meet required a precise description of location and patience when they were not immediately visible. The centre at Christmas was the most important place in the town. In many ways, it was. Closing time came the same way every evening. A voice, over the public address system, announced that the centre would be closing in 15 minutes, then in 5. Then the stores began to pull down their metal security shutters. A sound that travelled down the corridor in sequence as each shop front closed. A rolling mechanical clatter that meant the day was ending. The lights in the corridor stepped down slightly, a visual confirmation of what the announcement had already said. The people still inside moved toward the exits. The corridors that had been full an hour ago emptied quickly. The fountains were switched off. The arcade went dark. You walked out through the glass doors, and the temperature changed again. Cold British air after hours of warmth. The car park was still half full, engines running, headlights on if the light had already gone. The bus stop had a queue forming. You joined it or found your family's car, and the afternoon was over. The centre was behind you, its lights still visible through the glass frontage, to the last staff moving between the shuttered stores inside. For teenagers, the shopping centre had been freedom. Covered, warm, unsupervised freedom that required no explanation because it was a shopping centre and therefore a reasonable place to spend a Saturday. For families, it had been convenience. Everything in one location. The children occupied while the adults completed what needed completing. The food court meant nobody had to leave for meals. For Britain as a whole, it had been something the country turned out to need more than anyone had anticipated. A piece of covered public infrastructure that the climate made necessary and the decade made iconic. The memories are specific for those who were there. The smell when you pushed through the doors, the sound of the arcade from the corridor, the weight of coins in your pocket and the precise knowledge of how long they would last, the feeling of a Saturday afternoon stretching ahead of you with nowhere particular to be and the whole centre available to wander. It was not just a place to shop, it was somewhere to be. For those who carry memories of this particular world, there is always more history to explore.